Right, welcome to Group 4's Lab Assignment 4 on Chapter 6. Unfortunately, our fourth group member was not able to arrive for the recording, but she did help with the questions. For question 1, the resources will tend to gravitate towards the activity that is subsidized and away from the activity that is not subsidized, because that means they could pay less for subsidized activity. And for question B, they would tend to gravitate away from the activity that is taxed and towards the activity that is not taxed, because a taxed activity would usually cost more and they would have to pay more. Question 2, part A, the demand should be elastic if they want to have a small tax to convince a lot of people to stop eating junk food, because that if the demand is elastic, they are more likely to convince more people. But for part B, if they were to implement a high tax, the demand should be inelastic, because that means that people would be less likely to be convinced to stop eating junk food if there was a small tax, so that you would need a higher tax for an inelastic demand. And for C, it would have less of effect than if the supply was inelastic, because that means there are less substitutes for people to start eating instead of junk food. So they would have to be an inelastic supply. And for D, we chose option 2, an elastic supply and elastic demand from the questions before. And for question 3, total tax revenue is shown by the purple area. That is the quantity taxed, and times the tax amount. So it's the $1 tax amount times the 500 apples of quantity taxed. So it's $1 times 500, so $500 revenue. And the deadweight loss is represented by the gray area between the tax wedge and the equilibrium point, and that is equal to the area of a triangle, which is a half, times the $1 tax, times the quantity between the equilibrium and the tax wedge. So a half times $1 times 200 is $100 of deadweight loss.
So for part 4, in part A, it asks if a $2 tax was imposed, what price would buyers pay and what price would suppliers receive? To make a $2 tax work with this graph, the price paid by buyers would be 7, and the price received by sellers would be 5. And then the tax revenue is just the rectangle, so it would be $2 times the quantity, which is 4, and that equals $8. And then the deadweight loss is the blue triangle, and that is 0.5 times 2 times 1.5, which is $1.5. For part B, it asks if a $5 subsidy would impose, what price would buyers pay and what price would suppliers receive? So to make that work with this graph, the price paid by buyers would be $2 and the price received by sellers would be $7. And then the subsidy cost is the area of the rectangle. In this case, it would be the cost of per unit, which is 5, times the amount of units, which is 9, and that equals $45. And then the deadweight loss is the area of the triangle on the right of the graph, which is 0.5 times 5 times 3.5, which is 8.75. For question 5, part A, a wealthy person might be expected to have a more elastic labor supply. This is because the more elastic labor supply allows them to more easily move to a tax haven and get new workers to run the business than a poor person would be able to move and find another job. So for part B, luxury taxes are the demand for luxuries is elastic. So without the elasticity, the buyers will escape the tax easily, and the tax burden would primarily be on the sellers. And then for part C, it asked how effective is the estate tax. So while the textbook points out that individuals are able to sometimes accommodate the estate tax by changing the timing of their deaths, you can't really avoid dying. So so with a high demand of wealthy individuals wanting to leave an inheritance, the estate tax is very effective. For question 6, the base would indicate the per unit size of the tax, the price of the tax. and then the height represents the decrease in quantity caused by the tax. For Part B, it asks for turning your answers into general rules. The deadweight loss, so the larger the per unit size of the tax, the more deadweight loss is generated by the given tax. This because this causes the base of the triangle of the deadweight loss to increase, as well as the height of the deadweight loss triangle. So for Part C, if the base is constant, a higher deadweight loss would occur if the demand was elastic. This means that people are more willing to switch to something else. And then for Part D, you can answer the preceding questions for a subsidy. You just need the base and the height of your triangle.
For question 7, Part A, we're asked what the tax revenue and deadweight loss would be for each amount of tax imposed on the donuts. I have compiled a table that shows that for each amount of tax for the 20 cents, 25 cents, and 50 cents in the table, as you can see. So then for Part B, it asks the tax amount that would give you the largest amount of revenue. This would be the 50 cents amount. This would be the 50 cents point, as this would give you a tax revenue of $75,000, which is more than what any of the other amounts of tax would give you. And then for Part C, the amount of tax that will be the most efficient will be the 20 cents point in terms of amount of tax, because this would give you the smallest ratio of deadweight loss to tax revenue of all the 3 points at 0.2. And then for Part D, it asks what other goals might a government have apart from tax revenue. And another goal the government might have might be reducing the quantity of donuts consumed by the public, like which can be likened to cigarettes or junk food in other governments. And then for question 8, the cases where sellers avoid the tax burden completely would be cases where either the market demand is perfectly inelastic or the market supply is perfectly elastic. In these two cases, the sellers will be able to completely shift their supply and the price that they charge so that the buyers would be forced or would have to bear the entire load by actually buying the products. And then for the second part, it'd be in which cases would the subsidy affect only the sellers. In these cases, would only occur when either the market supply is perfectly inelastic or the market demand is perfectly elastic. As in these two cases, it will be because the sellers will not be able to shift the price, or the sellers will not be able to shift the quantity that they supply. And when this happens, they will not be able to allow for the buyers to pay less for what they actually for the goods that they sell. And in this case, the sellers will be able to enjoy the full subsidy that the governments provide. So this has been our presentation. Thank you. We appreciate you for listening. Have a good day.